Thank you. We'd like to start by acknowledging the Arente people whose land we're gathered upon. We'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to our elders, past, present and future, and thank them for welcoming us here for this gathering.
Thanks, Tanja. Gosh, I'm relatively new to the Aboriginal health family, as Pato refers to us, and it's a lovely family to be a part of, and certainly quite a privilege to be invited up to talk with Tanja today amongst such kind of legends within Aboriginal health. So I'm grateful for that. We're grateful for that opportunity. I was actually at a mental health conference a few months ago, and there was much discussion of suicide and really the failed efforts of psychiatry and psychology to prevent suicide. And as I said at that event, I think it's worth reflecting that prior to colonisation, the First Nations people of Australia had, if any, very few incidences of suicide. At that conference, reference was made to the growing scientific understanding of the connections between spiritual, emotional, mental and physical health, and they cited as has existed within Buddhist belief system for the last 2,000 years. We know that this understanding has existed amongst the first people of this country for 60,000 years, a belief system which almost perfectly prevented suicide. With this in mind, we'd like to pay our respects to all First Nations people in the room, all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends and colleagues whose lands we work and live upon, and whose long-standing knowledge, wisdom and traditions we all benefit from. We'd like to acknowledge colleagues at AMSANT and colleagues throughout the community-controlled health services, many conversations with whom have encouraged and contributed to the... I'm actually going to try and skip to our next slide, which we really wanted. Yeah, thank you. Many conversations with whom have encouraged and contributed to the work we're going to be discussing today, and a special mention to Alina Paul Cooper, who worked with us doing some research on trauma and trauma-informed care as part of an internship. But let's start with the idea of what trauma is. The importance of the word trauma to Aboriginal health and in other areas of health has only recently been recognised. We understand social and emotional wellbeing, which the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association defines as determined by connection to spirit, spirituality, ancestors, culture, community, family, kinship, mind, emotions and body. So mental health can be understood as one part of social and emotional wellbeing. Trauma is from an ancient Greek word meaning an injury to your body, such as a cut or a wound or a broken bone. Over time, this idea has become bigger. It can now also mean an injury to our mental health, to our social and emotional wellbeing. And it can also be used to describe the event which causes this kind of injury, as in a traumatic event. Within Aboriginal health, we know the histories and ongoing experiences of trauma within our communities. And we know the devastating health issues being faced within our communities. So we're well placed to emphasise the very real connection between experiences of trauma and devastating health issues, as it relates to the past, but also as a road sign for how to move forward. For understanding this connection provides even more support for the absolute need for Aboriginal community control over health services. At AMSANT, we're currently doing some work to support a better understanding of exactly how trauma wounds people biologically, emotionally, socially, and how this then leads to a variety of mental and physical health issues. This work involves supporting trauma-informed perspectives and ways of working for all staff throughout health services. We've undertaken this work because we believe that these understandings can enhance service delivery and outcomes for our services, communities and clients. Some of the most challenging, complicated and life-threatening issues faced within our health services can be better understood within the context of historical and ongoing experiences of trauma. Understanding this can inform how best to help with these issues. As we understand these challenging issues in relation to the stories of trauma that have haunted communities since colonisation, it's very important that we keep telling the stories of strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. It's vital that we keep reminding people of the central role of connection to culture, cultural identity and cultural continuity in maintaining social and emotional wellbeing, in keeping people strong, keeping people well and helping people to heal from trauma. At the National Indigenous Drug and Alcohol Conference, which was held in Melbourne earlier this year, Professor Naya Brown, a Yuin Nation woman from New South Wales and public Health Medical Officer, stated, "People talk about being Indigenous as if it's a risk factor. Being Indigenous is only a risk factor in a racist, discriminatory world." And she then went on to discuss that being Indigenous is actually an incredible protective factor, being a great source of strength, resilience and wisdom. As we talk about trauma, it's important for us to keep these strengths and protective factors in mind, which is why we've chosen to have the cover art from the latest edition of the Working Together, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mental Health and Wellbeing Principles and Practice as our background. This is Under the Milky Way by Janelle Green, a Badamaya woman of the Yamatji people of Central Wheat Belt in WA. The full description is at the front of the book, and I wish I had time to read it all, but we've chosen a few words to share. Spiritual and emotional well-being are at the heart of Indigenous cultures. Aboriginal Australians, despite suffering the greatest disadvantages and adversity, demonstrate the strongest resistance to those actions that are foreign to our unique culture, like separation from families, discrimination and removal from country. The moon and stars signify strength, and the smaller circles symbolise the elements of our culture that sustain us and keep us going, despite the desperation and shame we often feel as victims of racism and exclusion. The deep plum background is symbolic of our Mother Earth, from where we come and to where we return. When we talk about trauma psychologically, we're talking about mental and emotional wounds that happen as a result of experiences that are overwhelming and create a sense of fear, helplessness or horror. Experiences of trauma can be described as acute, resulting from a single or isolated instance, or complex, resulting from extended or repeated exposure to traumatic events. Trauma becomes complex when it's ongoing, often because of damaging relationships such as neglect or abuse that can start in early life and can have severe developmental impacts. In relation to trauma for Aboriginal people, Dr. Helen Milroy, a descendant of the Palkilyu people of the Pilbara region of WA, artist, storyteller and psychiatrist, uses these words. "Our country and people have suffered many traumas since colonisation, the magnitude of which is beyond words. Looking through trauma is like being trapped in the back of a mirror. There is no reflection of self. It's like being trapped in darkness, unable to see where to go or what is there, surrounded by not knowing, paralysed by fear. When we are wounded, our story is disrupted and life becomes fragmented. We may not be able to find our way forward and may start to see life through warped mirrors."
Children who have experienced trauma are more prone to anxiety, feeling like they can't settle down, depression, that deep sadness, physical complaints. They might not have the language to say, how we would talk as adults. They may show signs of anger and unhelpful behaviours. So you might get reports from schools and things like that. They might hurt themselves, they might hurt others, and they might be victims of others and victimisation of others. Similarly, they're prone to more risky behaviours, health risk behaviours such as engaging in drugs and alcohol, smoking, staying at home, which Dr. Wenentong talked about earlier, and also sexual promiscuity.
We also know that experiences of trauma are really common in the background of people with mental health difficulties. In addition to an increased risk of post-traumatic stress and depression, when we have experienced trauma, we're more likely to suffer from anxiety, eating disorders, psychotic and personality disorders, attempt suicide, or have alcohol or substance use disorders. A recent review of the literature actually found that childhood trauma was significantly related to experiences of psychosis, even after controlling for other variables, including a family history of psychosis. But the impacts are not restricted to mental health issues. Physical health suffers also. When we have experienced trauma, we have higher rates of health problems such as ischemic heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, liver disease and STIs, and that relates to a lot of what you were talking about earlier, Mark. Trauma can both delay and change the way an individual's brain develops, with severely traumatised kids likely to have smaller brains and changes in the structure and function of some areas compared to children who haven't had that exposure. One area that's affected by experiences of trauma for both children and adults is the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Axis, which is that axis involved in the fear or fight or flight response. It can become overdeveloped as a result of trauma, leading to an increased stress sensitivity and associated with symptoms such as high anxiety, impaired memory function, impaired impulse control, concentration and planning. Genetic studies, and again, Dr. Winnerton was talking about that earlier, have now found within that epigenetics area, they found biological ways that those changes in the fear response in mums can be passed on to babies, explaining how that can pass from one generation to the next. Experiences of trauma are associated with sensitising the stress response, increasing health risk behaviours, and reducing immune functioning. It's therefore not surprising that these experiences are associated with a range of challenging health issues.
These findings go hand in hand with our understanding of how experiences of trauma impact on people, how our lives become fragmented and fearful, and how these experiences have a huge impact on how we make sense of and manage our feelings, and how we may struggle with relationships with others and the world around us. We can see that there are a number of ways that cycles of trauma, we've heard the term intergenerational trauma, how it can occur through our body, through disrupted caring relationships, taken away from mums or other carers, ongoing difficult family troubles, and any trauma related to family mental health or, substance use issues, and through community violence. For our communities, this trauma is also increased by having high levels of stress and trauma, and in experiencing, again, levels of racism at all levels, and grief and loss. We're losing one person from chronic health, we may lose another person from suicide, and we're trying to get over one loss when we're trying to then deal with another. So we understand the story behind Professor Nari Brown's words, like being Aboriginal is talked about as if it's a risk factor. The difficulties within community suicide, violence, substance use are portrayed as if they are Aboriginal difficulties. But what we can see very clearly is that these are difficulties of unresolved trauma. This understanding shows us this urgent need for healing services, that social and emotional wellbeing services, the wellness services, as an important component of comprehensive primary health care. And with the staff and knowledge to facilitate the recovery, community controlled, they facilitate recovery, healing, enhance wellbeing, and doing so help to reduce these mental health, substance use issues within our communities. Again, we all know we can't have physical health without our emotional, mental and spiritual and cultural health, without these connections to keep us all strong. And while the wounds of trauma keep cycling, there's a possibility of ill health that will continue. So understanding these connections between trauma and a range of mental and physical health concerns, as well as connections with difficulties in managing how we feel, our emotions, challenges with our relationships, a sense of safety and control, trying to concentrate, remember, plan. We all know when we're stressed, sometimes we might not think clearly. It also helps us to better understand the added difficulty that people with trauma, that walking in that front door of a service, in building and sustaining relationships with health professionals, and in listening and trusting the health service treatment. Judy Atkinson is a descendant of the Jaimin people of Central West Queensland and the Bundjalung people of Northern New South Wales. University professor and author. She is well known for her book, Trauma Trails, Recreating Songlines, The Transgenerational Effects of Trauma in Indigenous Australia. She says, the effects of this trauma exposure can be severe and long-lasting. Consequently, trauma-informed policies and services are needed along with trauma-specific care. Trauma-informed services look at all aspects of their operation through a trauma lens, so that's how we're looking at working with our people. So they're guided by knowledge of trauma, having this knowledge that we've just talked about, and the impact that it has on our people's lives, and how that may impact on them receiving our services. So if overlooked, unresolved trauma can reduce the effectiveness of our services provided within communities impacted by trauma, and place people, communities and our workers at risk of further harm. So again, a strong message, it is vital that services do not operate in such a way that re-traumatises our people or our clients, our workers. However, without this understanding and awareness and knowledge of trauma, this may be a real risk. So other services which work with clients where there is a high likelihood of trauma in their background, such as services for homeless, refugee, alcohol, other drug, mental health services and Indigenous health services in Canada. So again, looking at some Canadian research, they have started to incorporate trauma-informed policies and practices which guide the work of all of those within those services. Not surprisingly, these services have reported improved engagement and outcomes for their people and the promotion of safe, good quality practice for our people and staff. So from that, we would like to share the core values of trauma-informed services, which are understanding, so knowing what the trauma it is and its impact on our people, our families and our communities. So pretty much what we're trying to discuss today. Another core value is promoting safety, ensuring cultural competence, supporting the client's control, sharing power and governance, integrating care and supporting relationship building and enabling recovery. These values help to guide the policies, service developments and staff training and support. So we can see that there are a number of ways that the principles of trauma-informed care and Aboriginal community-controlled health services align. Our community-controlled health services, by their very design, have been developed to promote safety, cultural safety, ensure cultural competence. We have our people working on the ground. Support clients' control, share power and governance, integrate care and support relationship building. As we said at the start, understanding the connections between trauma and ill health provides even more support for the necessity of Aboriginal community control over other health services. At AMCENT, we believe that it is critical that trauma-informed understandings are promoted amongst all services working with our people, as our people may have suffered a greater burden of complex intergenerational trauma. Within our community-controlled health services, we recognise an obvious need for more appropriately resourced social and emotional wellbeing and mental health programs within our sector that can provide these trauma-specific healing approaches and recovery services. But we also believe that integrating trauma-informed frameworks throughout all health services represents a major step forward on the path to better health and wellbeing outcomes for our people. It's timely to end with some more words from Helen Milroy. We are part of the dreaming. We have been in the dreaming for a long time before we are born on this earth, and we will return to this vast landscape at the end of our days. It provides for us during our time on earth a place to heal, to restore purpose and hope, and continue our destiny. We would like to end with, we have to understand that trauma is only a part of our story, and our story is a part of a much greater story and has a different beginning, is enduring, and will continue well beyond our lifetime. Thank you.
Thanks.